Paula, we can start our discussion today. First of all, I want to thank you, Paula, for this great talk. People are still coming in, so we are still waiting. And while this happens, I remind everybody to please post your questions in our Q&A section. And while we wait for people to post their questions and coming in, I have the privilege to start with a question and a comment. Maybe I will start with a comment, because while listening to you, Paula, and other keynotes so far, I was wondering how different this COVID-19 crisis is lived and felt depending on where you are and where you were born. And I was wondering even if it's possible to understand this crisis at all from a theoretical point of view at this point, I mean, with no historical perspective in a way. Because theorization involves generalizations, and in this case, to understand this crisis as a general phenomenon divested from the specific particularities and geopolitics context seems, or maybe misleading. But on the other hand, if we overlook the global perspective, we are also probably to lose something relevant. So we are facing a very, very challenging theoretical task here, I would say. And the idea of syndemic that you mentioned made me think that this crisis, as any crisis, is probably complexly intertwined, as you said, with previous crises. For instance, political violence, not just in the case of Chile, but many Middle East and other South American countries, economical crisis, crisis of trust and leadership, crisis of collaborative approaches, climate crisis, refugees, migration crisis, gender inequalities, etc. And this intertwinement between crises could be responsible of something that might be thought of as a general psychological experience, I would say, that it's emotional contradiction. In some way, COVID-19 enhances previous experience of suffering, deepening inequalities and transforming them into even darker ones, as you may say, in the face of illness, death, poverty, and so on. But at the same time, the crisis could suspend for a while those experiences of crisis. Not the crisis in themselves, but how they are felt. So, because it's like, this is a global crisis, it's not just my crisis, but everyone else's crisis. So it might also be an experience of relief. So this suspension may be felt with relief, with guilt, with fear, with joy. So I don't know, my question is, what do you think is the role of these contradictory feelings in mental health and in the mental health, in the impact of this crisis on mental health? And how psychology can tackle these experiences that are at the same time socially shared, but particularly configured and lived? Because maybe in addition to fear, as I said, and isolation and uncertainty, there might be complex social feelings here in contradiction. So what do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I wanted to present something very specific of Chile, but what you say is true. There are effects worldwide, general effects, psychological, and that it doesn't depend on where you were born. For example, I try to say some of them, uncertainty, and you already talked about. But I think also this has been like a stop. I don't know if there's no temporality in today. I think we all feel that. But there is also some conducts, feelings that were absolutely general. First of all, to deny, this is not going to happen to me. This is not going to come to our country or to our community. But then paranoid started, and now, oh, this is going to be, and when you have someone, family, or you know someone that has COVID, paranoid feelings starts a lot more. I think you can't, as any psychological social science, you can't separate what is individual and what is collective. And that's why I emphasize this idea that you have to look at what is general and expectable also, but what is particular, because this pandemic is not like every other crisis. This is absolutely new. There is, as you say, economical, migration, gender, but this is something that you are facing death. And so I think it's impossible to compare to any other crisis. That's what I think. So what you are commenting and asking, I think you have to see it in both ways, from the individual feelings, the society feelings, because, for example, in Chile, or I think in France, for example, there were also the yellow jackets. I don't know. Also, there were a lot of outbursts years before COVID. So we have to look it that way also. I don't know if I'm answering your question, or yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have a question from Gordana Jovanovic. Hello, Gordana. And she says, thank you, Paula, for your voices from the South, Latin South. You mentioned re-traumatization. Have you researched more on that? I assume that requires a qualitative approach. To what extent are achievements of Allende's socialist achievements vivid in memories or narratives? Do or did they appear in Chile in October?
What we lived in October, or from October, the 4 months that it was the social outburst, it was absolutely a remind, not of Allende, but of dictatorship. And I think what rised very with force was this idea that there is no social approach. And in that way, I think all the government of Allende, with all the view of how society must be, cultural and more egalitarian, arised. And the feeling of being collective, it was something very potent, I don't know how to say it, in people. So what I found, for example, in my research, when we did these open questions, there was no like direct narrative about that time, Allende, and what you're asking, but there was a lot of nice reflections about the positive aspect of COVID. And there was like mainly this collective, for example, these altruist conducts that are in all worldwide, when people gives or they offer to go to the supermarket for the elderly, or and in that way there is a sense of connecting to the neighbor, connecting to the other, even though there's also fear and there's ambivalence. I don't know if I answer.
We have another question. It's Camila. She says, from a different point of view, how can past crises, the recent experience of a great earthquake, 2010, or even the military dictatorship, act as coping resources? Thanks, Paula.
Thank you for the question. Earthquake and every catastrophe, and we're a country with a lot of earthquakes in all the senses. But I think sometimes when we have those subtle crises that we can't expect, as an earthquake, or that we have also these when the rivers flow out, there's the best and the worst of people arise. And I think we have this collective view of ourselves in those moments, but I think this crisis, you can say it's not crisis, but of what the Pinochet started in the government, those are crisis or trauma that's not from one event. It was years and years. So it was a constant fear. And I think COVID, in a way, it's going to resemble a little bit about that, but fear about something that you don't know in the case of COVID, and when was the dictatorship, a fear of the militaries. So I think there are things that are similar, but also you have to look at trauma here like something that's not ending. That's, yeah.
Maybe I can make another question. Just remind you that you can post your questions in our Q&A section. I was wondering about, you propose like online psychotherapy as a way of coping with mental health in the case of Chile, even considering the high rates of, well, inequalities and the sort of conditions, social conditions. But I was wondering if that's the best way to deal with mental health in our case, at least, considering that psychotherapy, even more online, cannot go beyond inequality and the neoliberal constraints in countries like Chile, in which that is very, very, how do you say, like extreme. So are there other ways to tackle this? And this is especially because this social outburst probably is going to come back. And of course, it depending on how that is going to be resolved, there are going to be many different impacts in mental health. So I don't know, it's just like social processes have this therapeutic as well, like thing that you mentioned. So maybe I was wondering, for example, if psychology should work with other disciplines and professionals, like promoting social projects, as art, physical activities, or this sort of things, like projecting a future together, and how these could help in this particular moment, because of course we have communitary psychology and so on, but now that we are facing this crisis intertwined with a political and social crisis, particularly in Chile. What do you think about this?
I think that when I talk about psychotherapy, it's something very specific. Psychotherapy or psychiatric treatment is something that you can think about in a step care. Mental health and psychotherapy is the last resource. You're right, I didn't talk about it, but of course there's a lot of interventions, social or individual, but I think, and one of them is to first to know what is normal to feel, for example, or other interventions that can support, promote well-being and hence coping with this time, and the interventions that, as you say, interdisciplinary interventions. There's going to be, and there are right now, a lot of economic issues, and I talked about it a little bit. And so I think a guide about what to do with this, not only giving these boxes of food that the government is giving. What I think is for today, because of course, for today we need more social interventions. I think that afterwards the pandemic, and when we're going to go out of the houses, I think we have to connect, to learn again to connect physically with each other. And therefore I think that these neighbors groups, or more community, there must be like talking and processing what they lived. So of course there's different layers of and I think authorities and press doesn't help in them, and especially press, it's a very huge way of communicating, and we are not, or they are not doing it very right.
Okay. We have a Gordana Jovanovic again. She says, may I add, are there insights that people voted for politics which brought about so many problems? I mean, Pinochet was not elected. Even worse, it was the desired North which was involved in installing dictatorship. I'm more interested in socio-political conditions of mental health. Or to put it more radically, does psychotherapy must include political education as well?
I think it's a very difficult question. In the social outburst, and I think in lesser with the pandemic also, but there was a lot, and even though there was this collective feeling, there was also these polarities in the political view of everybody. It was increasing every time. So the political stance was getting very strong, and in that way affecting a lot of mental health. General, I'm speaking about groups, family tensions, and so I think that polarity in Chile has always been present. People, of course, some people, and I think a lot of people, accepted like Pinochet, and those voted for Piñera. That in a way it's like, I don't know, a continuation, but it's a marketization of all the capitalism and all of that. So psychotherapy, it's a very individual or very, as I said in my present, intimate relationship. So how can you educate? I think in that very intimate relationship, when the first thing or what you're looking at is not to judge the way the other think, even though it's thinking opposite from you. I think that political education must be done at school, university. We had, how do you say this? Well, our parents had, ¿cómo se llama, Antonia, this civil
civic education.
Civic education. And then when we started school, there was no, they got out that. And I think that's the way also to start to educate, to know a little bit more, to know how to dialogue with the other that thinks different. Not really in psychotherapy, but.
Yeah, because there will be a lot of like suffering from political frustration, or also, I would say, in a way, the pandemic came as shutting down like a whole social movement that also involves contradictory feelings for many people, like joy again, and joy and hope, but also fear and uncertainty and ¿cómo se dice? Angustia, anguish. Do you think that because of this online psychotherapy would be, you propose like a way to cope with mental health in Chile? Do you think that online psychotherapy will be cheaper? There are other good reasons to think that it will be cheaper from, I would say, from a public health point of view, but also from a private point of view.
I think you and me are living it when we have this Congress and we have 2,000, almost 2,000 people inscribed. That's huge. I don't know if that would be possible if we're going to go to a city, to a country to make the conference. I think that's an example of, because not everyone, and I'm going to talk about, and especially in South America, we don't have the money to go to other country all the time to conferences. For example, that's a very little but inequality. So I think it is cheaper. It is cheaper, and I think it would be easier for the people with low economic to access it. We have this huge waiting list to be attended, and a lot of days, 40, I don't remember what I said. And Chile is a very segregated country, cities, and so when you have to travel a lot. People has to travel a lot. So if you think, okay, I'm going to go to the step care mental health, and then I have to wait, nobody. There's no motivation to do that. So I think it's going to be cheaper. I think, of course, it's going to arise how the same as it's arising now, that not everyone has internet, not everyone has the possibility to have, but there's also telephone. So I think it is, I don't know if it's going to be something very a psychotherapy, but it's going to be supportive interventions. I think it will help a lot of people.
Maybe also like group support interventions. Gordana wants to add another note. She says, I did not mean that psychotherapy should judge the views of patients, but to help them realize where the sources of their individual troubles and sufferings are coming from, particularly because they are coming also from political context.
Yeah, but I think that's, yeah, I'm sorry if I was misunderstood. I think that is something that we saw as psychotherapists. Many, for example, young patients very angry about, for example, violence or whatever. And there was a lot of thinking, of reflecting, and of looking, for example, at family, at grandparents, looking at the history of the family, and especially when there were tensions, when young adults want to separate from the ideas of parents, to individualize. So yeah, I was thinking about, you have that subject is going to be as a material in the session, but you can explore with the patient, but of course you're not going to educate. That was the word I maybe I did misunderstood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was thinking that maybe because in Chile we live very individualistic lives in a way, because we are like a very extreme neoliberal system. We have a very extreme neoliberal system. So maybe from the psychological point of view, our practices should be more oriented to group cohesion. And I would say that these online group supports, for instance, could be like very good ways to keep this like connectedness that arised on October, these like political projects at the same time supporting emotionally and so on. So maybe you want to just give some final words. We are 1 minute, we have 1 minute left.
No, just thank you for the invitation. I think, well, I am in that subject, so mental health for me, it's very important. I'm a clinician, so I'm looking to the individual and not so social. So this presentation made me get out and see the social picture, and so it was very good for me to make it. I hope it can be like a little grain in your knowledge and to make a contribution.
Thank you, Paula, for your brilliant talk and for taking a piece of Chile for the rest of the world. And thank you all the participants that join us today. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.